Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished and respected professional from Cambridge, UK, Dr. Michael Schluter, CBE. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Schluter is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives. He's an author of several books. His most recent books are Is Corporate Capitalism the Best We've Got to Offer? And No Other Way to Peace in Korea, A Practical Path to Reunification of the Peninsula. So, Michael, before we talk about Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives, tell me a little bit about your own amazing journey. And you just told me before we started recording that you were in India at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And what inspired you to establish the Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives?
So I was very interested originally in how one finds an alternative to capitalism, Marxism, and socialism, fascism. Mm-hmm. I was interested in big ideological questions. That's where I started my journey. I was in East Africa at the time. And many African students at Nairobi University at that time were asking me, look, coming out of my Christian background, what on earth do you think we can say to these ideologies which are challenging our continent? So that started me thinking and started me on a long journey, which made me realize that the most important thing in a person's life is their relationships, actually.
Right.
It's more important than money. It's more important to their happiness, their health, their well-being at every level. Is the quality of the relationships around them. But we have no analytical framework for being able to explore relationships in more depth, and we lack tools and ideas on how you build relationships, not just between individuals, but relationships between organizations and ultimately relationships between nations. And it's the nations bit that got me into the peace building business.
Amazing. So can you explain for my viewers and listeners the core philosophy behind relational peace building? And how does relational peace building differ from so many other initiatives or approaches?
So the core idea behind the way we've developed our relational thought is that there are 5 dimensions in building what we call relational proximity, whether it's between individuals or organizations or nations. You need directness of communication. So it's much better to meet face to face than by an email or even a Zoom call like this. If you could just be in the same room, makes a big difference.
Absolutely.
You can interpret 10,000 different facial expressions in another person. And when we have a Zoom call, at least you get a crack at that.
Correct.
And then you need continuity over time to get to trust people deeply. You need a breadth of knowledge of their background, just like the bits of background we were sharing with one another are of where we're coming from and why we're doing what we're doing. And then there's an issue of mutual respect and a sharing in decisions, things like that come in. And then there's, do we have a commonality of purpose? So I think we're both aligned on our purpose in the sense that we are seeking to give something back. We're seeking to do something good in the world. And that commonality of purpose is another source of bonding. So all of those things help us understand how to build deeper relationships.
Amazing. My next question is that what are some of the major challenges faced in peace building at an international level?
I think I identified 2 main ones to mention. The first is you need to identify and then build relationships which take time over time with the key people on both sides. So who are the leaders here and who are the people close to them who can have their ear? So you need to know who those people are, because it's much easier to influence the advisors to political leaders than to reach the political leaders themselves. But if you can reach the advisors, they will feed it in at the right time in the right way. secondly, I'm afraid it's a rather material consideration. If you are working for a government, if you are in an immediate situation where you're trying to release Hamas hostages and so on, it's quite easy to sell that idea to people. But if what you're trying to do is create a context for peace, if you're trying to build a shared vision between two groups like Russia and Ukraine, or North Korea and South Korea, if you're trying to do those kinds of things, it's much harder to raise the money for that, because it has to be done behind the scenes, and it takes time, a lot of time. So the fundraising becomes quite a critical constraint.
Very interesting. And Michael, what would you say are a few strategies you would find most effective in facilitating dialogue between conflicting parties?
So the way that we've done things is that we've tried to identify who the key people are to a particular situation. We've done a lot of research to find out what the key issues are that they are most concerned about, and then who are the experts that we can invite into the room. So we organize conferences based on this research to invite in both the parties and the experts who can speak to the particular issues that we know the parties want to talk about. Otherwise, why would the parties come? They didn't think they were going to get something useful out of it. You can't sort of go out there and say, oh, would you like to come to my conference? They say, well, we're busy, actually. Why should we travel halfway across the world to come to your conference so you can say that you have these people there? No, it's behind the scenes, so we're not going to publicize they're there anyway. But the point is, we have to have done the research and understand what is troubling them and why we believe that there are ways forward out of this conflict.
Fascinating. And are there any misconceptions about peace building that you would like to address?
Well, I think sometimes people think peace building is really about mediation. So let's get the two parties together and we'll get them to sort it out just by, as if a man and a woman in a marriage are having a quarrel. But international peace building is not like that. It is a more complicated issue in a way, because you've got so many interest groups pulling in different directions. And unless you've done a lot of research first and really worked out what people's interests are and what really matters to them, it may be financial, but it may be cultural or geopolitical in some way. It may be to do with military questions. All sorts of factors come in. So finding really what motivates people and interests them sufficiently to give up the time and make the effort to come in the same room and talk, then you won't make much progress, I think.
Okay. And when you talk about, you told me about some of the challenges that one faces with conflicting parties. What happens when it becomes diplomatic entities, and diplomats are trained, as they say, for peacekeeping and so on, or peace building? What are some of the challenges you face when talking to diplomats?
Well, I may not please many diplomats if I say this, but I think a lot of diplomats are trained in the skill of ambiguity.
Yes. Yes, all right.
So I think we want to try and cut through the red tape. It isn't really red tape, I mean, cut through the diplomatic language and the ambiguities. We want to deal with what the real substantive questions are, and that means you have to know what the substantive issues are on both sides, and you have to have thought about it or done research. In our case, we think about it more in research terms to see, well, where are the win-win solutions that are likely to be acceptable to both parties, and which you can then persuade them to think about, and then persuade them, all right, if these are possible shared outcomes, what are the stepping stones to get there? That's how we see it.
Okay. And are there any ethical principles that come into play when it comes to, peace building in conflict zones?
Well, I suppose the ethical principles are those that you would probably want to apply in almost any situation. It's vital that you are a person of integrity, that you don't say one thing to a person on one side of the conflict and then the opposite to somebody on the other side of the conflict, but you are always the same person to both sides in the conflict. That's crucial. That sense of knowing who you are and what you believe and why, and being willing to talk honestly to both sides about what you believe, so that they don't get a different story when they ask somebody, well, what did he say to you? And then you find, then that person finds you said it's completely the opposite. And then they think, well, this person really isn't being honest with me then. It's very important you retain your integrity. I think that's probably the main and primary principle. And then I think also there are certain basic relational skills about accepting people and listening to them carefully, not wanting to jump in with your idea straight away, but being willing to listen and understand where they're coming from. So those are probably at least a couple of the main principles I point.
No, they're absolutely fascinating. And my next question is, how is technology, and when I say technology, I also mean a lot of social media, how is that beginning to impact the whole process of peace building? Because, everyone seems to be sharing an opinion or a view or a rumor, and it's all over the place.
It is. And also I've noticed with BBC, they're talking about BBC Verify now. And they give a news which they call BBC Verify, i.e. we've verified the facts in this newscast.
Yes.
And I think it is a huge challenge to know how you ensure people realize who they're speaking to and don't confuse you with some AI scam, which may imitate your voice and pretend it's you and it isn't you at all. And I foresee that becoming a bigger and bigger problem in the future. It's about how you know that you're listening to the person you think you're talking to, and how they know that they're listening to you genuinely. So I see problems arising on that side. On the other side, the fact we can have a Zoom call like this, and that we can have a Zoom call with the parties, obviously is an enormous advantage, because you don't have to get on a flight every single time.
Correct.
But at the same time, it is so important that we are meeting people face to face, because they say you can recognize 10,000 expressions in another person.
Right.
So the facial language is very subtle. And although you pick up a lot of that in a Zoom call, you don't pick all of that up. You don't pick up all the body language. And also you don't see third parties in the room and how they're responding if you are talking between groups, say to companies, boardrooms or something. You don't see the finance officer frowning when the chief executive is making an offer to the other party, because if you saw that, you might realize that down the track you're going to have problems. So there's no substitute for face-to-face.
Absolutely. Sitting in a boardroom or sitting in a negotiating room, observing body language is such an important part of understanding what's going on.
Oh, it is. Yes, I absolutely agree. Yeah.
But my next question to you, Michael, is what qualities do you believe are essential for effective leadership in a peace building initiative or a process?
I suppose the main one is patience and perseverance. I mean, these things don't come quickly. And that's where we found that we can't, as a group, involve ourselves in very many conflict issues at the same time, because there just isn't time to spend with the parties. You have to be willing to put in a lot of time. And you can try for a quick fix at a political level, and that's what I'm sure a lot of diplomats do. And I'm not saying it isn't important and worthwhile to try and do that, but for the kind of peace building that we are trying to do, where we're trying to create a shared vision of the future, and that means that it's really important to understand what the future would look like and what would be acceptable to each party, and see where the win-win situations are. So I think it is about patiently building those relationships and being willing to have some setbacks on the journey, and some patience, because the geopolitical context may change, or somebody may say something which offends the other party, and then you've got to bring them back to the table. So it is a process, and you've got to be willing to put the time in over a period of years, not months.
Interesting. You've told me about qualities of an effective leader. You've told me about other aspects of peace building. But I wanted to ask you, what are some key lessons you have learned about human nature and conflict through your work?
I suppose I've learned that it's very difficult to classify people as bad guys and good guys.
Yes.
I think we're all flawed as people, including you and me, my brother. It's tough sometimes, and but there are always opportunities with people, as long as one is willing to spend time with them and listen to them and build their confidence. And so it does give me hope that every conflict situation can bring solutions. So you look at the Russia-Ukraine situation and how they're bashing against each other and killing each other at the borders, and putting down minefields and all the other horrendous things that are going on. And yet, I know Russians and I know Ukrainians, and I know them. The ones I know are all delightful people, and I'm thinking, surely it's possible to bring leaders from these two nations that have been close to one another for generations to come together and have a discussion and find ways forward that suit both of them. Now, why doesn't it happen? Well, I think partly it's a lack of research, honestly. People haven't really spent the time to dig down and see what the deep concerns are on both sides, why they are really fighting this war, which may be very different from what they're saying. And also where, I don't know, it may be shipment of grain coming out of Ukraine or something, but what other ways of imagining how this could be done might work and might actually tick the boxes of both sides. So so in that sense, it makes me very hopeful that almost any conflict you think of can be resolved peacefully if people are prepared to put enough time and work into looking for the way forward.
I agree. And probably put in a little more trust in the other person, which is difficult, I would imagine. But
yes, I think that is difficult. And there is a verse from Paul's writing in the New Testament that I like very much, where he says, he's talking about love, and he says, always think the best of what the other person is saying. Always assume the best, not the worst.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a kind of instinctive reaction that we have to assume the worst in other people and not assume the best. And particularly if we're in a conflict situation, we assume they're deceiving us. We assume that they've got some ulterior motive or something, instead of assuming the best of them and thinking, well, actually, they are grasping after something, and how can we make the most of that?
Great response. Thank you. My next question, in a world, Michael, where conflict is going on between Russia and Ukraine, there is conflict going on between Israel and Palestine, or Gaza, or Hamas. There are potential conflicts, of flashpoints in Korea, Taiwan, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia. As an expert in this area, what trends do you foresee in the field of international peace building?
My observation is that we're not seeing any decline in the number of conflicts taking place, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
And we are moving towards a multipolar world now in terms of geopolitics. So we've not just got the US and Russia as we had, the Cold War. We've now got China thrown into the mix as well as another huge player. So we are moving increasingly in a multipolar context, which complicates things significantly, but also potentially perhaps opens up more opportunities as well. I don't want to see it all negatively. In fact, I think there are many advantages in moving into a more multipolar world. I've always found it difficult, for example, with the US, in getting into the State Department. And particularly, when you build up a relationship with some senior people in the State Department, and then there's a change of president, and then there's a change in the top positions, and then you're kind of back to square one again.
Yes.
After 4 years or 8 years, whatever it may be. But when it's a multipolar world, some of the other poles in the geopolitical context may remain constant, for example. So I think there is going to be growing complexity in the geopolitical context of local conflicts, but it may open up more avenues of influence to the players on both sides.
Fascinating. I have time for 2 more questions for you. My next question is, can you share a specific case where your intervention led to a breakthrough in negotiations?
We were involved at the end of apartheid in trying to bring a peaceful transition to democratic rule in South Africa, and we were involved in that from 1986 to 1994. In 1994, just a few weeks before the first elections, obviously the Black African community were going to dominate in those elections, but they were badly split between the ANC and the Zulu party. So the Zulus are the biggest tribe in South Africa, or ethnic group, I should say, in South Africa, and they were quite split themselves. Some were supporting the ANC, but many of them were supporting the king of the Zulus and Chief Buthelezi, who had organized another political party called Inkatha. Inkatha was threatening to boycott the elections in South Africa. And the State Department said that if this is not resolved, then probably we're going to see 1 million people who will die on election day.
Wow.
In South Africa. I think it was April the 27th, as I remember. So this was a very critical moment in South Africa in 1994. So we realized how difficult it was for us with our white skins to be helpful and influential, but we had developed a close relationship with a very eminent Kenyan diplomat called Washington Akumu. And Washington Akumu knew Mandela, who was going to be the president, but he also knew Chief Buthelezi because he'd met him years before, I think at the prayer breakfast in Washington or something like that. He got to know him. So he knew both of them. So we knew Washington Akumu well, and we arranged for him to travel down to South Africa 3 times to be able to meet with Buthelezi and Mandela and try and find a way forward between them, which would bring peace. So he first went to Zimbabwe to meet with Mugabe, who was head of the Organization of Africa Unity, as it was called at that time, the OAU, and got his permission to intervene. And then he traveled down to South Africa, and he was able to meet with Chief Buthelezi in Durban and talk it through with him and talk through a possible peace program between them. And the consequence of all of that was that Inkatha did come into the elections, did participate, and after they appeared in public in Johannesburg on the same platform, Mandela, Buthelezi, and our friend Professor Akumu, from that moment that they appeared together and said, we have found a solution as to how this can work, the violence in the townships stopped overnight. Now, up to that time, 20 people every night had been killed, but what they were really worried about the State Department and the international community was 1 million people dying mass violence on election day in all the major cities across South Africa. But that never happened in the end because of this peace building process that had gone on in advance.
Incredible. What an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. And my last question to you, Michael, if you had one message to share with the world about peace and conflict resolution, what would it be?
Well, I think the message would be never think it's too complicated, never lose hope, and engage with the process in any way you can. Don't think it's outside the possibility that you could in some way make a difference. It may be through an internship in an organization. It may be through a piece of research you do. It may be simply through prayer, or it may be by giving money to the kinds of organizations that are working in this space. So there's all kinds of ways in which you may be able to influence the outcomes. Don't give up. Don't lose hope. Persist and get involved.
Amazing. And on that note, and your wonderful and powerful message, never think it's too complicated, don't lose hope, and engage. Thank you, Michael, for speaking to me about your own journey. Thank you for talking to me about relational peace building initiatives. And thank you also for talking to me at such length about different aspects of peace building, conflict resolution, and the role each one of us can play. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.